So this is part 3 of our lecture on chapter 53, and we were talking about survivorship curves. So again, a survivorship curve is when we plot the numbers or proportion of individuals in a cohort of 1,000 individuals that are still alive at each age. So, oops, you can see, sorry, that came in front there. You can see here at each age the number that are still alive. And so what we can see is that we get different types of survivorship. And our next slide, before I go on to that next slide, I started to say that up in the yellow here is a link to a Pearson, which is your textbook. What do I want to call this? It's an animation that is going to lead you through what you need to know about survivorship curves. And it gives you practice in answering questions about them. So it's excellent practice as you're reviewing for tests. And it's a way to make sure that you understand the different types of survivorship curve. So highly recommend this. I'm not going to grade you on whether you did this or not, but you can also find the link to it on Haiku. But in case you want to just type it in right now and save it, make sure you do that because this is an invaluable resource to help you. So now the different types of survivorship curves we have are simply called type 1, type 2, and type 3. So a type 1 curve is relatively flat at the start, which is reflecting a low death rate early in life, and then the death rate increases among the older age group. So you can see that humans are an example of a type 1 curve with a low death rate early in life, and then as the population, as the individuals age, there's a higher death rate. Many large mammals that produce few offspring have type 1 survivorship curves. The type 2 curve is like the squirrels that we saw. It's intermediate with a constant mortality over the whole lifespan of the organism. So many species of rodents, many invertebrates, and some annual plants show this type of survivorship. And then the last type is type 3, which drops sharply at the start, and that reflects a very high death rate early in life that flattens out as the death rate declines for the few individuals that survive the early part of the lifespan. So examples of that are many fishes, plants that live a long time, and most marine invertebrates. You can see the oyster here, where there are a lot of offspring, but most of them die, and only a few individuals make it. But if they do, then they have a long lifespan. Many species fall somewhere between the basic survivorship curves, or they'll show different types of curve at in different populations. For example, a crab can have a stair-stepped curve, which reflects the fact that it's going through molting periods when they are actually losing their shell, for example, and growing into larger ones. They're more susceptible to predation. And so they may have a higher death rate at those moments, but once they get through it, then their death rate stabilizes. So there are usually, if there's a stair-stepped curve, there's something going on in the lifespan that's causing the organisms and the individuals to be more susceptible to death. Okay, so I do need you to stop and write a summary of these different types of survivorship. What you can do also is go to that website on Pearson and work through the animation, which again, highly recommend. Can't tell you enough how highly I recommend that, that you practice in understanding the different types of curves. So the next type of population growth that we're going to be looking at is the reproductive rate. So for species with sexual reproduction, demographers will often concentrate on the females in the population only. And this is because they're going to be looking at the reproductive rates or fertility schedule in an age-specific summary of the reproductive rate of the population. So why is this important? Well, it's very closely related to the survivorship curves that we looked at before, and I kind of hinted at that as I was describing our different types. So when we have the type 1 survivorship curve, what we have is a very low death rate in the early part of life. And then over time, as the organisms age, there's a higher death rate. So in this type of population, with this type of survivorship, it's really not that important that there be a lot of offspring because the chances of the few that are born surviving is pretty high. So what we call that type of population, we call that a K-selected population. So what I was talking about there was the K-selected type of reproductive strategy. We're going to talk a lot more about this K-selected and R-selected later on in this lecture, but for now, what you need to know is that there's an association between a K-selected reproductive strategy and the survivorship curve. So with K-selected, there tends to be a late reproduction, later in life, few offspring, and there's a bigger investment in raising those offspring. And with R-selected, there's usually earlier reproduction in the lifespan, many offspring are produced, and there's little parental care. So K-selection tends to maximize the population size and operates in populations that are living near K. And we're going to look at what is K, but for now, know that K is the carrying capacity of a population in its environment. Whereas the R selection tends to maximize R, which is the per capita rate of increase. So this is going to occur in environments in where the population fluctuates well below the ability of the environment to support it. So we'll, again, don't worry about understanding that quite yet. We'll look at that more carefully up ahead. So, but again, this is repeating what I just said. Know that these are characteristics of reproductive strategies. K-selected being late reproduction, few offspring, and a bigger investment in raising those offspring. For example, with mammals, large mammals, humans, primates. We also have coconuts where there are very few offspring, but they tend to survive their early beginnings. Whereas R-selected, we have an earlier reproduction timetable with many offspring and little parental care. So most insects, many plants, they have disperse a ton of pollen. Tons of seeds are released by the plants. So these are our selective strategies. Part of what's involved in this is a trade-off or a balancing act that's measuring the cost of reproduction to the population. So if you increase reproduction, you can oftentimes decrease the survival or survivability of a population. So the age at first reproduction can determine how viable the adult will be throughout its lifespan. How much energy, how much time, how much resource is allocated per offspring is going to take a toll or a cost on the adult population, and also the number of reproductive cycles per lifetime. So natural selection is going to favor a life history that maximizes the entire lifetime reproductive success. So that's why bears can invest a lot of energy in one or two cubs, because over their lifetime, that's going to actually give them the best survivability or survivorship over time and as a population. And it tends to favor that. Whereas the sunflowers are going to be better served by having a lot of offspring. We actually can look at a table that is measuring the size of the brood, which is the number of offspring, in these kestrels. So this type of hawk has been studied, and the ability of the parents to survive the following winter was measured comparing different brood sizes. So either a large number of offspring or a small number of offspring, and then the average in the middle. And you can see here the difference that occurs between the smaller size of offspring and the larger here. There's a huge difference. And the biggest toll is among the males, and we'll see why that is. But there's a happy balance that you get here when you have what is considered the normal brood size, which again makes sense because natural selection again is going to favor the individuals that have the best results. So the reason we see that difference between males and females, and that it actually costs both of them, is because males are involved in the kestrel falcons in taking care of the offspring. So you can see here, this is a summary of that study, that the lower survival rate of the kestrels with larger broods showed that the caring for more offspring negatively affect the survival of the parents. And so you want to, as a population, have the most number of living offspring that you can to make and populate the next generation, but you want to do that without killing off the adults. So that's all this is talking about. The parental survival rate is a balancing act. These trade-offs affect not just kestrel falcons, but all organisms actually are playing this balancing game or act here. So the trade-off in the number of size of the offspring versus the survival of the offspring or the parent. And again, we have this comparison of R-selected versus K-selected. Because the R-selected are when we have this multiple numbers, large numbers of offspring, and there's very little parental care involved. So the cost to the parent is very low. But the K-selected, you have very few offspring, but a lot of parental care goes into them. So there is a cost to the parents, to the adults, so they need to limit the number that they actually produce. So stop and summarize the difference between these two different reproductive strategies, the K and the R, and give an example of each, describing the survivorship curve that would look like. So pause, make sure this gets into your notes. So we're going to be looking a little bit more about this R-selected and K-selected. And what that really is referring to is whether a population is density independent or density dependent. So it would make sense if you have a lot of offspring being reproduced with that R reproductive strategy, that means that population is not really influenced by how dense it is. So it's density independent. In that case, the birth rate and the death rate don't really change with the population's density. So natural selection is going to favor a life history trait that maximizes reproduction. So therefore, you're